dispel a myth, right, or a question that's on the minds of most of you at this moment. No, I did not wear a ponytail while I was superintendent of the Oregon State Penitentiary. And let me make that clear. Throughout my entire law enforcement career, it was a military appearance, which I enjoyed. It complemented my capacity as a conservative law enforcement professional. After I retired, having been brought up during the 60s and being quite active during that period of time, after I retired, after about 6 weeks, I just felt my hair beginning to grow again. The 60s caught back up with me, and I'm very active in the abolition movement. Thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to present some of my experiences and how I've come to be before you as an abolitionist. And I appreciate Phil's saying that I am not here to lecture because you can hardly call what I have to say as being a lecture. I'm not here to teach anybody anything, but I want to lead you through my story. It's sort of a saga. Southern kid, born in the civil rights days, and sort of aimlessly with divine intervention most of the time, had some significant experiences that gives me a passion and a commitment for getting rid of the death penalty in the state of Oregon and hopefully across the country. I would like to thank Phil Spurl and the Institute for Continued Learning Curriculum Committee for working together to afford me the honor to be your guest presenter. Since having retired from the Oregon Department of Corrections in 2010, I've heard many great things about the ICL, and I've considered enrolling myself. And now that I have this opportunity, I can't think of much better of a motivator to do just that, depending on how you treat me. Again, I'm very grateful to be able to share my thoughts with such, and I do mean this, such a distinguished group of individuals through such a distinguished organization such as Willamette University. Some of you may know a gentleman by the name of Ron Steiner. Ron Steiner is just really, really quite an individual. He is my chairperson of the organization Oregonians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. He's a friend of Phil Blitz. I was telling him that I had been chosen to make this presentation, and he raised his brow in apparent awe and said, "Whoa, Frank, that is quite an intelligent group of folk." Now, I wasn't really sure what he was trying to say to me. But Phil put my mind at ease, and I am thoroughly glad to be here. I'm going to try and lead you through 3 segments. It's not scientific, it's not academic, but I think hopefully you can recognize 3 segments of my life and my experiences that come together will explain why I'm here. First, I'm going to, and thank you for the introduction, Phil, I'm going to sort of go back and punctuate a little bit of Phil's presentation to let you understand who I am on the road to becoming an abolitionist. Secondly, you should pick from my presentation bits and pieces about the Oregon Department of Corrections overall and how it has changed since the time I've come here in 1994, at least up until 2010 when I retire. And I hope you can respect the fact as a retired person, I don't pretend to be speaking for the Department of Corrections. They have very capable professional staff who are on top, and I'm very proud to have been a part of that organization, but resist the temptation that I'm speaking for in an official capacity for the Oregon Department of Corrections, which I think is a very good organization, and I'm proud to have been a part of it. And then, by the end of my presentation, I hope we have enough time to get to, for me, what has become the meat and potatoes of most of my presentations. I want Oregonians to stop killing people. I'm passionate about getting rid of the death penalty. I have the experience of leading people through the exercise of taking life. And as an old country boy, I remember one time we had a turkey my dad bought us, and we raised this turkey. And we used to fight each other about going out to feed old Rocky. And Rocky grew, and he got to the place when he'd hear the door slam, his feathers would go up, and we had fun. We played with Rocky. And one November evening, my little sister ran up to me and said, "Come here, Frank." And we looked out the window, and Dad was working on Rocky. And when he came in the house, he told us what the plans were for Rocky. And the next day, we sat down around the table, and there Rocky was. Unbeknownst to me and the rest of us, Dad and Mom had done a ham. But Dad probably went and told her what apparently was going on in our minds. And we just could not get off to a good start. The taking of life at any level needs to have a redeeming outcome of some sort, if at all possible. And if it is not possible, reasonable alternatives should be sought. And here in Oregon, we have reasonable alternatives. You might hear parts of this again as a part of my wrap-up. How did I get here? Raised in the rural, born in the rural, farming community, interdependent culture. Church was the core of the community, as is the case in many rural communities throughout the country. Our families' home destroyed or burned or damaged by storm. Men would come out of the fields, and the surrounding homes would take in the family until they could move back into their habitable abode. I'd gained a sense of community, which I still look for in many of the places my wife and I have lived over the years and raised our daughter. Frustratingly and disappointingly, I don't find that fabric nearly as much as it used to be. Grew up on the edges of Little Rock, Arkansas, but still farming, truck farming, cows, chickens, that work ethic. And like Phil said, we used to go to church on Sundays, and we'd pass by this corner where some of the unsavory characters of the neighborhood sort of hung out. And Dad would catch me sort of craning my neck. There were a couple of guys who could play some good football and good basketball. And I wanted to be with them. And Dad saw me craning my neck, and he changed his route and wouldn't go to church by that corner on Sundays. He kept me busy until I was beginning to form the kind of habits that would help get me to where I am today. Went through high school in Arkansas, in Little Rock. And I was a teenager when Emmett Till was killed in Mississippi. Some of you are nodding your heads. And it was about that time I became acutely aware of what my being black was. Prior to that, I didn't have any problem. I was happy, fed every day. School I went to was just fine. I didn't have any idea of what I was being denied on a larger scheme of things. But Emmett Till got killed in Mississippi for having allegedly gotten fresh with a white woman. And since that time, I don't know whether either of you have read, she has come forward and said that she lied. And he was lynched. Now, in the Christian community that I was growing up at that time, it was readily discussed that capital punishment was a just social response to those people who killed that young man. And capital punishment, they weren't saying it. Some of the Christians even weren't as polite to say capital punishment. They were saying they need to hang them. They need to just get those. And the vengeance out of my community was sort of new to me. I mean, we'd be at church sometimes and standing outside. That really wrecked the black community. Capital punishment as a result of committing a heinous crime. I'll never forget how that sank into my psyche. And it sank into my psyche as being along the continuum of social responses to crime, that it had a place. So at the age of about 13, I began to nurture, not advocate for, but accept at least capital punishment as being an acceptable social response to heinous crimes. That event so affected me that I used to go and pay bills at the age of about 14. I would get on a segregated bus, and from where the driver was, this was within 4 or 5 weeks of Till's being killed. And all the way from where the driver was back to the segregated section of the bus, I can remember looking at the ceiling of the bus or the floor of the bus to be sure that my eyes didn't inadvertently fall on the gaze or the eyes of a white woman on the bus. There was an activism that was born in my spirit because in 57 through 70, a lot of stuff started happening in this country. The Congress of Racial Equality was driving through the South, attempting to integrate Greyhound buses and transportation. There were sit-ins in Carolina throughout the South attempting to integrate school buses. And there was Little Rock, Arkansas, when Dwight Eisenhower federalized the troops. And I can hear the trucks coming in. It was Highway 64 then. It's now Interstate 40. You could hear the trucks. We knew they were coming. The word was, and you could hear the trucks coming in to Arkansas to go and situate themselves around Central High. And in fact, of the 9 young people brave young people, that helped to integrate Central High School, I know 4 of them personally, 5. One of them lives such that I could stand on the back porch where I used to live. She had a brother who wasn't able to go to public schools. He stayed at home, and he had a little rhythmic behavior about himself. I could see him in the backyard playing with the different toys. That's how close Elizabeth lived to me. So the Little Rock Central High School crisis, and then the beginning of the Martin Luther King era was beginning to come up. That was a part of who I was becoming. I graduated from high school wanting to be a doctor. So we looked around and tried to find a school that had a pre-med program. There was only one. Anybody in here from Arkansas? The only pre-med program was in northwest Arkansas in a town called Fayetteville, the University of Arkansas, the Razorbacks. It was segregated. Blacks couldn't live in the dormitories, but I wanted to be a doctor. Went up to Fayetteville, found a room in the basement of a white family's home, had to walk 2 miles, and it can get cold in Fayetteville. Shortly after having been there, my attention turned more toward getting in those dorms than studying my chemistry and my biology. I got involved in civil rights. I got involved in demonstrating, trying to get the dormitories integrated. I got involved with a local community there where we attempted to, with success, get the restaurants and the cinemas integrated. We had success along those lines. Before I left the University of Arkansas to go to service, we had not succeeded in getting our dormitories integrated. I could not eat in the cafeteria with all of the other white students, but there was a section of the commissary that they would allow us, that were 3 undergraduates such as myself. The rest of the blacks on campus were graduate students. Now, as you hear me talk, don't feel sorry for me. I ain't mad. I'm able to look back over those experiences, and they built character, and after a while, it gave me purpose and focus. After 2 years, I realized this ain't gonna work. I left, went to service, became a military policeman, got and served in Korea, came back to that same school because I was a little irked at it because I had to leave it. So I said to myself, I'm gonna get my degree from this very school. So I went back to the University of Arkansas, 2 years, got my undergraduate degree in sociology. When I graduated, I still had GI Bill left. And I said, I tell you what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna get my law degree and go into corrections and maybe at some higher level of administration. I can use my knowledge and my legal training to help improve and work with the criminal justice system, because I had already become aware that the criminal justice system in our country reeked disproportionately its programs and its incarcerations results against the poor, particularly blacks, across the South was just horrible. So I envisioned myself of working from the inside. I was tired of the street. I was tired of placards and demonstrating. And I said, I'll get my law degree and go into criminal justice and train. After about 2.5 years, I did 2.5 years of law school, I got some job offers that I just couldn't turn away. And law school is pretty tough. I don't know how many of you are lawyers or have been through law school, but you'll agree with me when I say law school is not the kind of involvement that you couldn't with the intention of going back to. You get in law school and you go through and get it done. Making up your mind to go back to law school is a real tough one, particularly when you've got a fairly decent job. Those experiences with my training in law school and my having been a military policeman, and I did have some administrative positions in between, qualified me to become personnel administrator for the Arkansas Department of Corrections, and that's the beginning of how I became qualified to be selected as superintendent of the Oregon State Penitentiary. When I came to Oregon in 1994, it was within 5 years of Michael Frankie having been killed. It's a huge investigation. I didn't even know about it. I was employed before I learned of that history. But I soon learned how deep and how scarring and how shocking to the system that investigation was. And when I got here, the staff were roundly not anticipating change and not asking for change. They just didn't know what the next boot was going to be that was going to fall. And in some ways that was sort of good for me because I was brought in from the outside, and as most penitentiaries that have the culture as Oregon State Penitentiary has, you do need to be able to get cooperation from the staff and have them willing to see what new direction you're going to move in. And as it turned out, I was very, very fortunate. When you move into an old culture like that, maximum security institution, with some of the most violent inmates that a community can house, you need people who know the population. You need people who know the history. You need people who are able to walk back into the bowels of that business and talk with inmates and get the pulse. And believe it or not, there is such a thing as getting the pulse. Those of you who have children coming home from work, there's a certain bustling or noise in the house that you usually, TV set with a certain program that's usually on, or Johnny's chasing Mary, or that's just a little business around your own that you sort of feel, but you open that door and if things are significantly different, you don't know quite what it is, but you know things are different. Well, correctional professionals, after a while, can walk out to the yard or walk through, and these are two places where getting the pulses of your institution are critical. If you can't read your staff and the inmates in your environment, the yard, the recreation yard, and and where they eat, in chow hall. I was really impressed when I got to the Oregon State Penitentiary, because I'm from Arkansas. We had whole squads, field riders riding on horses with shotguns saddled on their hips, and the inmates were always under the gun. And as they toured me in Oregon, there were these inmates in blue jeans, and the correctional officer was walking among them. Whoa. When they toured me through Oregon State Penitentiary, and we went to that proverbial rec yard and walked through that chow hall, I had to look around to find where the officer was or where the officers were. And if I looked just a little bit, I'd recognize their uniform. They were all in the middle of the inmates walking around. In Arkansas, it's line movement. You had to walk in a line, and an officer was predictably stationed at strategic points where there would be congregate observation of all movements, and if either of the inmates broke the line, that inmate would be held accountable. In some of our institutions there, back in the hallways, where the inmates would be moving, sometimes, depending on who they were, particularly if it was a female that was not a staff member, but maybe a contractor, a female would walk into the hall and someone would scream, "Female in the hall," and every inmate would turn toward the wall. But in Oregon, staff is walking around among the inmates, and I'm going, whoa, something's different here in Oregon. I went out on the rec yard. Inmates playing basketball and lifting weights, and boy, some of those guys. I had to look around to find the correctional, and sure enough, the correctional officers are out among the inmates, talking to them and engaging with them. That, I don't know how, in a maximum security environment, Oregon grew into that kind of supervision and management of its inmate population, but it's here, and it's been here for a while. And it was here the day that I arrived in 1994. Just as unique to Oregon as that is, and not pumping your own gas. Where I'm from, down in Arkansas, if you have an offender and you're going to do a shakedown of a subject or an inmate, you put them to the wall and you shake them down from the back. And me, with my years of experience, I came in and I saw a correctional officer. The inmate was facing him, and the correctional officer was shaking him down. And I'm saying, we got a correctional officer that's going to need a little tutoring. So I talked to my chief of security. He said, no, boss. Oh, by the way, he said, no, boss. Everybody called the superintendent in Oregon State Penitentiary boss. And that's the first time a white man ever said boss to me. He said, no, boss, we don't do it that way here. We believe that by facing the inmate, it forces the inmate to have eye contact. And there's an exchange. You can't really describe, and I know exactly what he meant at the moment. So in Oregon, they had different ways of doing things. So what I did was I decided I was not going to come into this system and start moving desks and moving clocks and transporting a lot of what I had learned. I had sound, fundamental, solid correctional experience, but I wanted to absorb what was working and why was it working here. And we had some I had some veteran staff people. Once they saw, and one of the first things I did, one of my first meetings with them, I told them just that. I said, I want you to continue doing just what you're doing. Now, if there's a crisis, I know what to do. Remember, I'm in charge. I'm responsible. But I want you to continue doing what you've been doing before I arrived. Your Monday morning staff meetings, I want you to continue doing, keep me posted, and I want to learn. That was probably one of the more important things I could have done in being introduced, because I was from the outside, and that was rarely done. I'm giving you this feeling for the oldest penitentiary in the state of Oregon as I try to bring it forward today. I want you to be able to sort of touch it. Everybody was extremely sensitive because a lot of people had been accused of being involved in corruption in association with the Michael Franke case. As you know, there was an inmate that was convicted of it, but everybody in Oregon, and it's become a nationwide story, everybody in Oregon is not convinced that that case has been solved. When I got here, the inmate population statewide was around 6,000. It is now about 14,000. We had about 11 institutions in the state of Oregon when I arrived in 1994. Now we have 15. The Department of Corrections is third behind health and education in the use of your tax dollars. But it is increasing at a pace exceeding that of which we are devoting to education. Now let that stick in your mind now. You got a good system by traditional, current, and popular definitions. Oregon rates well among correctional facilities. If you look at it that way, there's a lot to be proud of. But there's a lot wrong with correctional facilities in the greater picture of criminal justice and how it's being administered across the country regarding the best ways to put inmates back into the community so that they will not reoffend. We have a collective consciousness in this country that sending people to prison for punishment is the best way to make the community safer. No. And I agree with you. Here in Oregon, the philosophy is put a product back in the community that will not reoffend. And that is the best way to make your community safer. In 2013, and I was doing my research on the internet, and the most current information that I was able to get in terms of the Department of Corrections expenditure annual, in 2013, it was in excess of $1 billion, $1.4 billion. And at that particular time, that was at a rate of $84 a day per inmate. Now, $84 a day per inmate does not reflect the cost of an inmate on death row. Your staff to inmate ratio is much smaller. You have 24-hour coverage of one officer, 2 or 3 officers covering the men and women on death row, whereas you may have one staff person covering 150 inmates otherwise throughout the institution on tiers. The Oregon Department of Correction has moved from an era when custody and security were its primary product, keeping them under control and keeping them where they're not hurting each other and the community. It was its primary product. But just before I got here, Senator Kevin Maddox sponsored a bill called Measure 17, which required that every inmate work just as hard as the average citizen. Very, very noble idea. It was roundly supported by the citizens of Oregon, so much so it became a part of the Oregon Constitution. So we got to do this. It's in the Constitution. Well, as often is the case with legislation, when you roll it out and try to make it work, there are kinks in it. Measure 17 is still here, and it's a good piece of legislation. But one of the challenges to it was you can't put 100%, and that's what it was asking, of any inmate population to work 40 hours a week. Some need to get their GEDs. Some have to have mental health treatment, alcohol, drug treatment, training. So there are a wide range of legitimate activities that inmates throughout every institution are involved in every day that may not be driving a nail or swinging or pushing a broom. So at the risk of oversimplification, the Department of Corrections staff worked with the governor's office and the legislature and Mr. Maddox, and we worked out a system that in part is inmate work programs where inmates have jobs. We had worked out an incentive system that recognizes when an inmate is programming according to their prescribed incarceration plan, which includes in other words, when you came into the Oregon system, you went to Coffee Creek, and they did a diagnostic testing period with you to determine what your criminogenic factors were. Was it alcohol and drugs? Was it mental health issues? Was it lack of an education and training? Or was it a combination of all of those? Depending upon what the results of those tests were, we'd look in the department and see what resources and what trainings and what treatment programs we could match to that profile, and we'd tell that inmate, over your next 10 years in the Department of Corrections, when we see you, we want to see you dealing with those 4 things, and we want you to deal with it credibly, and if you behave yourself, we have an incentive system in place where you can earn privileges. And you can get an increased level of privileges the longer you're consistent in moving forward with your incarceration plan. That is the bullet, that's the key that turns people around. They are in the system because they came from an environment where they didn't know how to delay instant gratification. They didn't know how to set a goal and work toward it. They didn't have the discipline of saying, I want to separate myself from my gang associates and go to the point where I can have more time on the rec yard. And I can see some of you waiting for me to mention that TV set. I want to behave, I want to comply, and I want to work with the incentive system so that I can get a television set, little small TVs that they can put. Providing incentives in a prison is one of the best ways to make an inmate a human being who has needs, who wants to improve their quality of life, say, hanging out with Bubba is not going to help me get more letters, more phone calls. It's not going to help me improve the quality of life. Well, the Oregon Department of Corrections has in place a system that is called the Performance Recognition and Award System. And I was fortunate to have been the lead with a group of my staff to introduce that notion and work with other staff and the governor's office and legislators to where it is being implemented throughout the state of Oregon. Other systems in the country are making note of the Oregon accountability model. The Oregon accountability model, in one part, has the PRAS, Performance Recognition and Award System. As we move into discussing this capital punishment thing, I'd like for you to kind of put this inmate on a gurney over here. This inmate over here on this gurney, he kidnapped a 7-year-old, held him hostage, this inmate right over here. Held him hostage over the weekend, slit his throat after having molested him for 48 hours. And the state of Oregon intends to kill this inmate, to execute him. If you can, try not to focus on it. And it's going to be hard because almost every person, when it comes to the capital punishment issue, can remember a story that they have read, and on some level in their psyche, they just sort of inwardly say, forgive me, but on this case, Whatever that urge, at whatever level that is in your psyche, let's sort of It's over there, it's real, it's in the state of Oregon. We've got capital punishment on the books. Meanwhile, during my presentation, put on your public administration hat, your legislator's hat. Put on your hat about promoting and establishing good public policy. The kind of public policy that after a time, you can go back and evaluate it and say, you know, we're getting out of this public policy the kind of results that makes our community safer. There are benchmarks, there are evidence-based criteria that this public policy is meeting such that we will take the risk another 2 years to see if we can't improve upon it. Capital punishment has been around, I don't even guess hazard years. You know how long capital punishment has been around in this country. The United States Supreme Court at one point declared it as being unconstitutional. So we went back, right back at it again, and it really hasn't gotten any better. Nobody presents a convincing argument that capital punishment is a good deterrent. The costs of capital punishment are just spiraling out of control in every state in the union, and in every state of the union, corrections is outpacing education in the commitment of funds. Now why can't there be a collective, something ain't right with this public policy. Not I want to get this guy over here on the gurney. Is there a better way? Are there reasonable alternatives? There are states in the union that don't have capital punishment, and they are not clamoring to enact it. But here's where I come from largely. You know, it's almost 20 after. I'd like to pause right about now to ask, are there any questions? And so that I can segue into another part of the reason I'm here. Be patient with me, my hearing aids are acting up today.
Well, mine isn't either. My name's Betsy. I would like your assessment of the usefulness of the College Inside program at the penitentiary.
The usefulness of the...
College Inside program.
Which program is that?
College Inside.
Yeah, College Inside. At the penitentiary, there's a program where an inmate can go to school, and what they call the College Inside.
The Pell Grant, it's one of the better programs. It's one of the better programs that the Department of Corrections, certainly during my experience, it is one of the better programs. The Pell Grant was being issued and made available to inmates in order to take college courses. At one point, and I'm not remembering the years, the Pell Grant fell off the table and was not available. According to my understanding, and it had nothing to do, when it fell off the table, it had nothing to do with any failures in it. It was a top flight program. The department champions the Pell Grant, the College Inside program. I was speaking to one of the members of your group here, yes, who teaches a class at Chemeketa to a group of inmates. That's way up here. At the risk of oversimplification, it works well.
This is Rosamond. Could you elaborate on the increased costs for capital punishment? Is that due to the increased legal appeals and delays in order to stop the execution?
I don't need to say anymore. Yes. a lot of people say they don't understand $28 million to administer the death penalty in the state of Oregon, and we've only executed 2 people in the last 50 years. $28 million for 7 staff to run death row 24/7 throughout the year for the number of people that are on death row. And where's that coming from? It is coming from the fact that each one of those inmates on death row have a litany of appeal rights before they are ever executed. And I've had people observe to me, well, Frank, if that's the deal, if it's the appeal, let's just shorten the appeals process. That'll save a lot of money. And I go, no, hold it. To our credit, since we're going to have capital punishment, the appeals process is our best effort to try and be sure that those that we do execute are guilty of the crimes that they've been convicted. So if we're going to have it, we need to tote that load and bear the burden of its expense, because the system is killing innocent people. Since capital punishment was reinstated serially across the country after the United States declared it unconstitutional, there are better, after the advent of DNA and other kinds of investigatory techniques, there are now more than 160 people who have been released altogether, or their sentences have been changed from a death sentence to life without the possibility of parole. Now, with my experience, that kind of calculus says we've killed innocent people. We certainly killed innocent people in Vietnam. We certainly killed innocent people in almost any kind of socially promoted endeavor in the name of protecting ourselves. That was a long answer to your question.
Sharon, in the 1970s and 80s, I did a study with League of Women Voters on juvenile delinquency, and as part of that, Scared Straight and all that came up. And then I participated in the penitentiary's Lifers group. Lifers group and the legal process class. And it was interesting talking to inmates that had such lengthy and difficult and violent histories, and they would say, I had to go in and shoot or go into armed robbery or shoot someone because. And often it was because they couldn't make it on the outside. They didn't have the skills, they didn't have the support system. And I noticed what you mentioned about the steps. It sounds wonderful. But the part about juvenile delinquency, I don't know if you can speak to that at all. It seemed like you would go into all these programs and they'd be harsh or they'd be whatever it is, and the programs weren't working well. So I don't know how you can connect the penitentiary with the juvenile, what's changed in that at all. But you're right, I was very impressed with the penitentiary system.
You're raising the question of what can we do better in... Now you can't hear me, huh? I may need some assistance in being sure that I got the essence of your question, but are you asking me to make a comment on what can the system do better in terms of making sure that this person doesn't recidivate? Yes. One of the large reasons for their being in the first place is the lack of training. That is one of the, it's almost like the pursuit of good health. You'll always be working at it, and you ought to work at it every day, and you ought to find ways of getting better. In our trade, in the industry, there's this concept called seamless transitioning. That is, after you identify the criminogenic factors when an individual is in prison and you get them on the right treatment track and you get them their GED, and maybe you need, or maybe they've even had an opportunity to work in an area where they get a trade that they can use on the outside. We've got to have a collective community of people like ourselves who will hire that individual. Do you know that there are people who still to this day will say, rehabilitate them? Oh, I don't believe in rehabilitation. He's an ex-con. He's a convict. Our laws say that after you satisfy your sentence, you are whole. You're back in the community. We've got to work on a collective conscience that we owe it to ourselves to employ that individual if you possibly can. Now, that same question was asked, and I can't remember to whom. It was one of the leaders and one of the legislators that was supporting the Department of Corrections. You need to put your money where your mouth is. And the department said, okay, we are going to get inmates ready during our reentry programming. And when they get released, if they have skills in plumbing, now you don't want to take an inmate who is guilty of fraud at the bank and put him in the accounting office. But if an inmate develops skills in the plumbing area and he's eligible for parole and he's out a certain amount of time off parole, we will hire him in our maintenance department. So the Department of Corrections has made that commitment, and they are in fact doing those kinds of things. We need to do that, ma'am, on a larger and grander scale. We need to talk that up. And those of you who have contacts in the community in any regards capable of having something to talk that up. The Department of Corrections is already doing it, and we need to do more of that. Did I respond to your question? Okay. It was almost like my mom, get back over there.
And stay there. This is Lester. One of the things I see in the judicial arguments about capital punishment, it seems there is no discussion of what is the issue of killing someone, but more the issue of how we kill them. The 3-drug cocktail, or what other methods is humane in killing someone. So I see that in our judicial system, it's not about the act of killing, but how we do it.
And regretfully, you're correct. And I'm not really sure where that's leading us. Sometimes a riot in a community turns out to be a good thing, because when you rebuild it, you're certain to try and rebuild it better than it was before it was torn down. We have had some botched executions here as of recent. And the conversation has turned toward, we want to perpetuate, we want to continue this capital punishment, but we want to do it in a way that's not so, we don't want to botch anymore. That's embarrassing, and all of those kinds of things. So much so that, believe it or not, there has been a decline of individuals being sentenced to death across the country, even in those states like Texas and Florida. There's been a decline. Last year was the first year where the fewest number of death sentences were handed out and the fewest number of people were executed, because all of the states with the death penalty are nervous about their methodology of taking life. And I agree with you, that's not the best consideration for dealing with the death penalty. Most of the states are concerned about, many of the states are concerned about administering death where it is obviously gruesome, and we have had some bad situations. We need to keep our eye on the prize in terms of whether or not capital punishment is protecting the community. If it is not, we won't worry about the manner in which to execute. We'll decide on reasonable alternatives. And reasonable alternatives is life without the possibility of parole. Now, there are a number of people who say, Thompson, I've heard too many times that this life sentence and life this and life of years. I understand, ma'am. I want you to understand that life without the possibility of parole means he or she will die in prison. Now, there are various kinds of life sentences that are meted out throughout the country, many of which have conditions that if the inmate meets them, they can get a release before their life ends. But these are not capital punishment examples. Life without the possibility of parole means that person is not getting out. That is a reasonable alternative, even for this guy over here, because killing him will not make my front door any safer to walk out of tomorrow morning. The process that takes this guy's life is not a tool for vengeance. The process that takes this guy's life is supposed, and pardon me for the is supposed to make it safer for my daughter to walk down to the mailbox and get the mail. And if I'm not any less apprehensive about doing just that after this guy's life is taken, something's wrong.
My name is David over here.
Raise your hand. Okay.
Yeah, some of the nations in Western Europe have done away with the death penalty, and I assume that some of the people in this country are looking at what they have done and what the results have been. Is that correct or not?
Yes, a number of organizations are looking at how is it that these countries have those kinds of attitudes and put in those practices. And it's sort of hard to put a handle on it other than to be able to say it's the difference in the culture. It's the difference in the mindset. It's the difference in the willingness to look and see what is the collective best way to go for that community. I know that sounds very philosophical, but in healthcare or in education and criminal justice, there are European countries that best the United States in so many different ways because they look at it differently. And how they look at it differently, I'm not at the best advantage to articulate, but we have a culture here that I'm going to risk. For me, I'll tell you what I think we'll have to. I think we have to, on some level, as a community, a country, deal with. We talk about inclusiveness and taking care of one another. We use neighborhood and community interchangeably. For me, there's a vast difference. Community means doing those things which has everybody else's interest as a part in what is done. We as a society champion getting up and doing what is best for me. And at some juncture when there's a conflict in that process that serves my personal interest, only then do we really take serious prescriptive and disciplined and proactive and long-term activity to try and come up with public policies that help the broader community. I think in some ways that's a small expression of where we fall through the cracks when we take this long look about what's going wrong. And we need to have a sustained discipline. Now, I'm not talking about different forms of government. I ain't going into, I'm just talking about a humanistic approach toward what's best for where we exist. And those countries seem to have a jargon, have a mindset that when they sit down at the table, they produce those kinds of products that address more of the community than it does self-serving interests. And I appreciate you letting me go down that road, but that's what works for me. Thank you for your patience. We'll take up a little bit later, but I see I'm supposed to be watching Phil. Phil just did that. Well, there are about 5 people out there that's going like this. So it's about time to take a break. Thank you so much. I got some rewarding feedback during the break. And when I started, I was saying if I could just get one, I'll consider it worth it. And I got 3 or 4 hmms. There are many systems we have that make our society work. There's the industry of air flight, there's the railway system, there are the systems of transportation on our interstates. And we have key people at strategic points of all of these operations who are calculating whether or not the casualties, to include death, are calculated risk for the betterment of a society. We don't want anybody to die, but we're going to try and improve our interstate system, and we're going to try and make the flight of airplanes safer because our society depends on them working well. Yeah, every once in a while, a plane falls out of the sky, but by and large, that's one of those risks, unfortunately, we have to take while we're still plugging along, dispatching an investigation team to go and find out where that plane fell, so that won't happen again. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll submit to you that we need to be looking at capital punishment. Just as hard as we are, we've got a federal team that will dispatch just like that if a plane falls out of the sky. Rightfully so. Capital punishment is killing innocent people. Killing innocent people. That's not what our criminal justice system is about. And at some point, we do have to ask ourselves, is taking this person's life, as much as a part of my gut that I've got to wrestle with and put it back in perspective, is taking this person's life worth the calculated risk that this system presents in taking an innocent person's life somewhere on some state at some time? Does it produce to the overall community such an overwhelming fabric of public safety that that calculated risk is worth it? We've got to get serious about asking those kinds of questions. I'm going to give you now a real-life experience that gave me my Saul to Paul moment. And changing from being an advocate of the death penalty starting back when Emmett Till was killed, all the way through my law enforcement career. I never was out waving banners for it, but back in the back of my psyche, just like I was when I was a military police in service, if military armed conflict came to me, I was leaving there alive. And I knew what I had to do, and I was prepared to do it. Well, you know, in the back of my psyche, capital punishment was this system that needed improvement, just like our economy needed improvement, just like so many of the systems needed. So I wandered through law enforcement, came to Oregon. I was asked in my interview, Frank, Frank, you know Oregon is a capital punishment state. You know you might have to execute somebody, even though we haven't done it in 32 years, but it could happen. You think you could do it? Being the kind of soldier I am, having been trained to take life under very narrow and specific circumstances, having been in the military, and I was good with a weapon. I said, yes, I can do my job. I can do my job. Hope against hope that I'd be like many a police officer who was trained to use his weapon, but retired after 30 years, never having had to put his hand on his gun. And the majority of police officers were like that. And I was hoping that I'd come to Oregon and have a similar experience, but no. 18 months after I was here, less than that, Governor Kitzhaber, out of his office, a death warrant was issued. The inmate involved had volunteered his execution. And by volunteering his execution, I meant he didn't want to do his appeals, exhaust his appeals. In fact, both of the inmates that were executed, if they had not exhausted their appeals, they'd probably be on death row today. That was an experience in Arkansas. I need to backtrack just a little bit to put where I am right now. I hadn't done any execution before I left Arkansas as a warden. This is 1994. Now, there was an inmate by the name of Billy Ray Rector. There was an inmate by the name of Billy Ray Rector, who, in his attempts to escape apprehension, shot himself in the head and rendered himself absolutely mentally incompetent. And this was before the United States Supreme Court indicated or ruled that mental incompetency is a reason not to execute. But they were going to execute Billy Ray Rector, and I remember so well that Bill Clinton came off of the campaign trail to Arkansas to punctuate his candidacy to that base out there that supported the death penalty, to be sure that Billy Ray Rector was executed. By the way, Hillary and Bill were law instructors at the law school I went to for 2.5 years. So I knew him back in the day, so to speak. But Bill came to Arkansas to make sure that this guy's execution went through. Billy Ray Rector had, you think you've been hearing about horrific and botched executions over the last 2 or 3 years. Billy Ray Rector was making guttural sounds, and if it sort of disturbs you a little bit to hear me recount this, this is all a part of, ladies and gentlemen, this happened in life. This is what's happening in our country. He had a botched execution so significant, so severe, until a employee chaplain said, I can't take this anymore. And he quit his job. Now that was just before I was promoted to come out here. So, not thinking that it was going to come together, in the back of my mind, I'm aware of a botched execution some 25 years ago, a botched execution in Arkansas, and it affected a chaplain who had been working with that inmate, so until the chaplain quit. Fast forward, back in Oregon, 18 months later, I get this warrant. I took inventory of my situation, and I looked around. It's been 32 years since there's been an execution. Is there anybody in the building that knows anything about conducting execution? No. Is there anybody in town that knows anything about conducting executions? And the state and the law at that time said the superintendent of the Oregon State Penitentiary shall, from A to Z, it was my responsibility to execute this guy who had just volunteered. So I had to lead a team that would write the execution protocol, which was still execution by gas. They hadn't revised the protocol for executing. We had to rewrite the protocols for executions from gas to lethal injection. I had to train, I personally, I sometimes get choked up every time I get to this point. I took the guy who depressed the plunger and put the lethal fluids into the veins of the inmate that was executed, took him up in a room. I had been trained by a professional out of Arkansas. I trained the executioner on how to administer the drugs. Now this is getting personal, folk. Now if I come to Oregon and they already had a team in place and this fell in front of me, I would have called my team together and said, you know what we got to do? Yeah, boss, yeah. Okay, pull out the manual and Robert, you take the lead and let's get started on this thing. What do you do? I probably could have done 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 until I got tired eventually. But no, now on this one, I had to work through every dotted I, cross T, every nuance, identify the gurney. We didn't have a gurney. I called around state hospitals, county hospitals, and when I tell them what I needed it for, I didn't realize I shouldn't have done that. You don't call a hospital to get a gurney where you can kill somebody. It was hard for me to get a gurney. And the experience I went through in identifying an executioner confidentially. I'm new to Oregon. I don't know anybody. Now, how do I go about identifying somebody confidentially to perform? I would need to ask somebody to help me find somebody confidentially, and that would expand the knowledge base of who the executioner was. Now, hold that right there. Now, that's this officer that resigned in Arkansas because of what he witnessed when the inmate was executed. I'm at the point now where I am beginning to choose my staff that's going to be on the tie-down team, who's going to escort the inmate into the room, tie him on the gurney. And this is the beginning, y'all. It struck me. I am training decent men and women to take the life of a human being in the name of a public policy that can't be shown to work. I am causing decent men and women with more deliberation, with more contemplation, with more aforethought, with more intent than any inmate on death row in the country went through before killing someone. There's a cost. You cannot take human life without losing a part of your own humanity. I don't care what you say about him. When those two planes ran into the towers in New York, if we had dispatched fighter pilots out to stop them before hitting the tower, that's one of those things where you're protecting, and you're at the point where there aren't reasonable alternatives. And protecting isn't the same thing as, with premeditation, taking the life of a human being when there are reasonable alternatives. If somebody's kicking in my door, I'll say, quit knocking. My wife and child are waiting in the back, huddled. They heard all this noise, and they keep kicking in the door. I'll say, you better leave me alone. And the door cracks open. And I see this head stick in and something that appears to be a weapon. My intention is not going to kill him, but in protecting my wife, somebody's life might be lost. That's not what we're talking about here. Capital punishment takes place in our society when there are reasonable alternatives. And so I've got this team that I'm going to be training on how to take a human's life. And if there's anybody who wants to do it while I'm talking, you can go to Google right now and you can put into Google correctional officer stress. That's all you got to put in there. And you'll find that being a correctional officer ranks right up at the top fifth of all disciplines in this country. Everybody that walks into the bowels of a penitentiary, that door locks behind them and they go in and try to keep calm and decent operations every day. The penitentiary environment reeks with stress. And here Frank Thompson goes and picks a team of people out of this population of already stressed out people and takes them in methodically, deliberately, with aforethought, and train them to take human life. Now go to Google and put in that correctional officer executions. And I guarantee you, you're going to find the acronyms PTSD. PTSD is high, very high, among correctional officers that have participated in execution, alcoholism, domestic violence, suicide. Now, do we get enough bang for the buck as a broader community in the United States or several ES states? Do we get enough bang for the money and the resources committed and the risks that we expose these correctional officers to, that we say that we can justify those casualties? PTSD isn't always a plane crash-like event. It's cumulative. It's cumulative, and it builds, and it builds. I really don't know what I'd do if I didn't have an opportunity to present my story to a group of people like yourselves. I have confidence that somebody in this group is going to go to their church, their Rotary Club, their organization where there's another group of people who need to hear what they're doing to correctional officers because they get this guy. I've had people say to me, Frank, well, the correctional officers, like a well-known politician said about a Green Beret that lost his life over in Niger. In trying to console the parents, he said something like, well, he knew what he was getting into. Now, that's when I almost lose it. They come to me and say, well, Frank, they volunteered, didn't they? Let me use this gentleman here as an example. Let's say, this gentleman worked for me. Testing, testing, testing. Are we good? I'm too old for that. And I know that I've got to get prepared for an execution. The law says, okay. The law says that I have to use volunteers. And I go to him, and your name? Don. I said, Don, I need to build my execution team. Now, the law says you volunteer. You don't have to do this. But I've been watching you since I've been in here, and you are respected by everybody I talk to. I need somebody that I can depend on, and I need for you to help build this team. I need some references from you about, I'm new here, I don't know people like you do. How long have you been here? 20 years. 20 years. So you know what I need, and I need you. Now you volunteer now. But unless I can get this team together, this whole execution thing is just gonna be. Now whether he believes in the death penalty or not, whether he believes in the death penalty or not, what's the likelihood that he's going to join my team? Very high, very high. And throughout the country, you have death penalty teams that are made up of people who are good soldiers, who signed a contract with the state, you and me, and they're about to embark upon one of the most daunting experiences that man can present to the other. They are not trained killers like Green Beret soldiers are. This young man that lost his life in Nashville, he was at the top. His job was to go into dangerous areas and take life if necessary. Correctional officers' jobs are to maintain peace and quiet, feed, clothe, educate, train, and just a little snippet out of their lives, they are required to go and take the life of a human being. People ask me, Frank, what was going through your mind at the moment? When I get this question, back in the day, you remember they used to have celebrations and parties at hangings where people would come out, lunches, and it'd be an all-day event. Some of that stuff is still around in our communities. And sometimes I'll get a question, Frank, what were you thinking at the time? What was it like at the time the lethal chemicals started? How did it feel? I really don't like answering that question. I apologize to anybody in here who wants to know on that level. But factually, I was more concerned about my staff than the inmate on the gurney, because I knew that there had to be a victim to that process. And I wanted there to be only one victim. I wanted to minimize. Those who do any research on the amount of money and training that went into that first execution will find it's in print now. We spent over $200,000 for the first execution. That was a lot more money than many executions cost, because I trained because of my military experience. I trained my staff until my assistant superintendent for security came to me and said, Frank, the tie-down team, they're up to here in training. And I said, that's what I want to hear. Tell them to go and do it for me one more time. Train them until they were doing it by rote and they weren't getting racked emotionally and going from one step to the next. I was concerned. My biggest concern was my staff. That's where our minds need to be, ladies and gentlemen. When we commission a director of a Department of Corrections to go in and execute that person, there's a team of men and women that you are sentencing to incrementally a lifetime of PTSD. And don't assume that most of them aren't. It's just only one or two. If just one person on that team begins to suffer PTSD in the name of a public policy that cannot be shown to work, and your communities aren't any safer, and it's costing over $28 million in the state of Oregon to keep that policy alive, and we've not executed anybody over the last 52 years. Duh. Help me. And the cause of abolition. If you have a church, if you have a civic organization, where either one of us on our board at OADP can come and make our presentations, not to change your mind, but put this whole capital punishment thing in a public policy perspective to where you can look at it differently. And I'm sure some of you that are vehemently, there are some of you who are against capital punishment as much as I am, but you're getting tired of the same old back and forth, does it deter? Well, what about this, that, and the other, and you don't seem to be making progress. The majority of people I'm talking to nowadays don't think about the men and women that go into this room with premeditated aforethought deliberately to an extent greater than any murderer on death row in our country. We ask them to do it, and there are reasonable alternatives, and you know what I'm about to suggest. That's life without the possibility of parole. Now, the death penalty in Oregon is in our Constitution. That makes it a fairly steep hill to climb, but we can do it. I'm confident because across the country, the movement says it can be done. Violent crime has been on a downhill trajectory now for better than violent crime of all sorts has been on a downhill trajectory for over 20 years. Nobody's really sure of why that's happening, but not just capital crime, but capital crimes are represented in the downhill trajectory. There are prosecutors now that are being elected who, as a part of their campaign platform, are letting it be known, I do not intend to file capital charges against anyone if I'm elected. So there are more ways to skin the cat. There are manufacturers across the world who are saying, we're not going to sell you any more drugs to be killing people, notch by notch, bit by bit. Last year, we witnessed the fewest number of people executed in this country in many years. The capital punishment statutes are still on the. We have more moratoriums in the country right now among states than we've had in many years. And in that regard, and there are others, John Kitzhaber is my hero. As a physician, 2 times, I sat in front of him and watched him gulp as I trained him in his role about what we on a team needed to do to take somebody's life. Governor Kitzhaber didn't want to be there, and there's a little film on YouTube right now where 3 of us, Director Dave Cook, myself, and Governor Kitzhaber, we talked about those 2 executions. You can help by giving our organization an opportunity to get capital punishment off of the books and out of our Constitution. How's that? Are there questions?
This is Irene. And the thing that troubles me is that so many teenagers are given, they are tried as adults. And everybody knows teenagers are not adults, but our system allows them to be tried and sentenced as adults. And the Supreme Court has a ruling about this, but most of those young people will never get out because they go through a system that isn't allowing the type of appeals and whatever it is for them to get out. They had something on PBS about this. And I wonder about it. For them, it's a death sentence, even though they were just very young when they committed their crime.
That was, can you help me with that one? Should teenagers be tried as adults?
Many of these young people will never get out of prison, so their sentence that is so long and the appeals are so complicated that they can never get out of prison because of the nature of their crime, even though they were very young, and we know that brains aren't developed till they're at least 25. But they're still tried as adults and treated like adults.
That's another one of the kinks in our criminal justice system. At some point, it's going to have to be addressed. A young person, because of the nature of the crime, can be found sentenced and doing time with mature criminals in prisons, and they can be held in juvenile facilities until they're old enough to go to prisons for the rest of their life. I find that to be offensive to the common decency and immoral even. If we do believe that we have human beings in our communities that are minors, I do find that offensive, and it's something that our criminal justice system needs to address. Our criminal justice system, with spots of bright lights, by and large, is broken. It's bankrupting our communities, it's killing innocent people, it's disproportionately sentencing poor people to prison, where if you've got the means available, you can hire an attorney and not be sentenced or get off at all. In one state here in Oregon, I'm just giving you a litany of the miscarriage of justice that our system had. Right here in Oregon, there are cases where if an individual commits a particular crime in a given county, they may be charged with a lesser degree of crime. Same crime committed in Multnomah County, they may be charged with a capital. So one is going to die and the other not. So there are just, and yours, when children are involved, you get to my heart, and that's an area that I don't have an answer, but that needs to be addressed.
My name is Eunice, and this is a bit on the personal level. I worked for the Oregon State Police and in human resources, and the state police had a team to sort of see that the executions of those two convicts went smoothly. And then as a final result, they were given letters, what we called attaboy letters, and it was up to me to file them in their files. Several letters apiece for each of the teams. It hit home quite hard.
It isn't either of you. The sound, I've got 2 hearing aids, and the sound, the next time a question is asked, I'm going up to the person. I'm going to ask you to.
Yeah, I can tell you, she said that as an employee of the Oregon State Police, She was instructed to draft attaboy letters to part of the team that assisted in some of those in some of the two executions that you were having to proceed with. Do you know anything about that? It was put in their files as a commendation by the superintendent of state police.
Was anything put in their files
Yes.
because?
Yeah.
No. We,
Yeah, this was just a comment. Yeah.
okay. At the state police, there was something put in their files. At the Oregon State Penitentiary, we didn't. And you know, you're touching on a point that I had a little bit of a problem with. The whole system at the pen under the law was confidential. And to recognize somebody in writing or put it into a public record and probably offended the spirit of confidentiality for us. So we did not give letters of commendation. The people that volunteered understood that they would be getting overtime and they would get increased pay for the training that they went through, and that's the extent that we went to.
Hypothetical, kind of a reverse case scenario. You may be familiar with it. You've got somebody like a serial killer who says he's incorrigible. He planted his victims in his own backyard, so we've got data showing that he's responsible. And he's sentenced to life in prison without parole. And he sues the state saying that life in prison for me, I'm not like most people, for me, life in prison is cruel and unusual punishment. I want to be allowed to die. What do you do with that?
I guess at some point all of us reach a point where others might feel that you're a little bit callous and insensitive. I just say let him sue. Let him sue, and we'll see where it goes. Now, I've got so much energy, and with all due respect to the question, those kinds of lawsuits are being sponsored over the country, and they're not getting that far. That's not much traction. So much energy right now is keeping capital punishment alive or trying to get it off the books, that those kinds of petitions just have not gotten traction. Your question does represent a movement among abolitionists. There are board members that sit on the Oregonians for alternatives to the death penalty, who believe that locking a person up for the rest of their life isn't the answer, and they point to those European countries that don't do that. So that's not off the table. But right now, for me, my answer is, since I've worked inside, I know people who are doing life without the possibility of parole, who are providing hospice services for other inmates who are dying. I know people who are serving life without the possibility of parole, who are training police dogs that police officers can use in the community that save their lives. A person serving life without the possibility of parole can find a positive reason to live and exist and serve their fellow person in the correction system. The correction system is a small city that has all sorts of needs. And I personally would talk to him and just sort of say to him, good luck.
Frank,
Need somebody over here that can work in the plumbing shop. You want to take the test and see what you can do until your case is heard.
Frank, you've done a fantastic job, and I think we have to give you a hand.